Hey everyone, it's Dr. RAMANI. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and antagonistic, toxic, difficult relationships. Today we're going to talk about something, do a little bit of self-exploration. What are your tripwires? And you may wonder what I mean, so let's take that apart. What are your tripwires? Personally, not even talking about your narcissistic relationship. What are the things in your life that when they happen, your nervous system feels like it lights up like a fireworks show, and not in a good way? That they unsettle you. These are things that leave you wide-eyed, uncomfortable. And let's face it, what do we do when things make us uncomfortable? We avoid them. So, a little consciously, a little unconsciously, we set up lives for ourselves where we try to set things up so those tripwires don't get set off, so we are not as uncomfortable. Makes sense, right? So a tripwire is basically, if you don't know, it's like something that's often linked to an explosive device, and somebody could literally trip over it. Boom, the explosive device goes off. Okay, so let's say your tripwire, for example, is being financially insecure. As a result, you may work lots of jobs you hate, be really savvy, be really anxious and careful about money. Your life may not feel good, you hate your job, you never or rarely indulge in that much fun, you don't even take a small vacation, don't ever buy anything new. But to avoid that tripwire of financial insecurity, you live a life that keeps that at bay, the discomfort of the job you dislike and the austerity, sort of the misery of your life is almost preferred to the tripwire of having to deal with financial insecurity. If your tripwire is being alone is really difficult for you, that's a tough one, because there's a likelihood then that you may be willing to put up with a lot in a friendship or in a relationship to avoid the feeling or the possibility of being alone. Now, I'm calling these things tripwires instead of triggers because so many people have co-opted that word in so many ways. These tripwires I'm talking about may not even be as reactive as a trigger. They're almost sort of soaked into our emotional DNA. Now, the key is to know your tripwires, and that's a deep dive that we often don't do. Well, this is a narcissism channel, so you may be wondering, why does this matter in narcissism? It's actually crucial to understand this. Number one, these damned tripwires are often shaped by narcissistic family systems. The things that happen in these families, being invalidated, not being seen, not being heard, being shamed for expressing needs, conditional love, they set the tone for our tripwires. And sadly, you would think, well, wouldn't that be great? A person growing up like this would think, oh, not being seen is bad. Nope. Instead, we learn that we aren't worthy of being seen. And in fact, our tripwires may be things like being afraid of making someone angry, being afraid of letting someone down, being afraid of being not enough. So, how do those get us into a narcissistic relationship? It's a pretty diabolical 1-2 punch. Initially, a narcissistic relationship can be quite alluring as an adult because not only is it somewhat familiar and reminiscent of what we experienced as children, but in those love bomby days, we may feel seen, loved, valued, desired, and enough. So we get to address an old need, and then bam, the game changes, the devaluing begins, the trauma bond is in place, and now those tripwires, I don't want to make them angry, I don't want to let them down, I don't want to be not enough, those are all in place. And how do we avoid them? By exhausting ourselves, invalidating ourselves, and becoming exactly what the narcissistic person wants. Number two, those tripwires keep us stuck. Avoiding pain is the most natural thing for any living thing to do, and sadly, is often the thing that most limits our growth. Nobody intentionally wants to touch a flame. That stuckness of trying to avoid the things that set us off, whatever that may be, abandonment, fear of being alone, fear of looking foolish, fear of not fitting in, can mean that we keep doing something that limits our growth. Number 3, keep in mind, narcissistic people have tripwires too, and when they get tripped, they lash out angrily. Listen, I would argue that many people with narcissistic personalities might even have them more than most. Narcissism is a very thin-skinned personality style. That's why we see that reactive sensitivity. A little feedback towards them turns into them giving you a rageful rant. The tripwires, they feel like they set off bombs. Most narcissistic folks don't have easy histories themselves. The problem is that our fear of their tripwire getting tripped turns the rest of us into tense eggshell walking and frightened friends and family, never knowing what will set them off. And since we have our own tripwires, perhaps our own fear of conflict, our fear of rage, our fear of setting them off, coupled with their tripwires, whatever they may be, that may set them into rage, means that these relationships are literally like booby-trapped fields. We often don't think about what our tripwires are. It's not exactly a fun weekend activity to think about, but it's important to do. Sit down and think about this issue, whether in therapy, through journaling, or just on your own. What are these sensitivities, these tripwires in you? How do they limit you? How can you help yourself feel safer? Where do you think your tripwires originated? And more than anything, do you think your tripwires have kept you stuck in a narcissistic or toxic relationship? The first step is knowing them. Once we know them and how we behave and feel once they are set off, it can be a useful start to help us understand a bit more about why we get stuck in toxic relationships, hold ourselves back, and remind ourselves that sometimes that when these tripwires get hit, the world doesn't end. It's sort of like a glitter bomb situation. It can be messy, and that damned glitter gets everywhere. But you'll be okay. But step 1, figure out your tripwires before a toxic person does and harnesses your tripwires to their advantage. This kind of content on healing and understanding how to heal is something we do a much deeper dive in on my healing platform. If you're interested in doing that deeper healing work from a narcissistic relationship, please look at the video notes for a link to the healing program. Thanks again.